Molly's Story by Pat Allen of Springwood, 2777. Narrated by Janine Penfold. Molly was pensive, her eyes filling with tears. She began to relate her secret, ashamedly hidden for over 50 years. "I want to tell you, though I could never tell your brothers." She broke off to take her breath. "I am what is called a bastard." "What do you mean, Mum?" I had no inkling this conversation could ever take place between my mother and me. "My parents were not married," she blurted out the words. "I became a state ward, along with my sister and 3 brothers. We 5 were sent to Sydney and allowed to be fostered out, if anyone would take us." Mum had always intimated that she had been adopted as a child, though she had not actually used that word. "I remember being in the courtroom and hearing words flying about my head, not understanding any of it, until my father asked the judge if he could make one request. When the judge nodded to him, he simply said, 'I ask just that my children never be separated.' The judge agreed and granted his request. Dad seemed satisfied that he'd done all he could." Mum smiled at the memory. "Why was this happening?" I was completely surprised. "Well, we were living very happily with Mum and Dad on his farm out of Casino. Apparently, a neighbour reported to authorities that there were children living in some kind of moral danger there, so we children were brought before the court and ultimately declared state wards and sent away." "But why was that the charge against you children?" "Well, you see, our parents were not married to each other. Dad was already married to another lady, and there were 3 other children with her. She also had her own cottage on Dad's farm." Mum hesitated for a few minutes. "She was Mum's sister. It did look bad." Aghast at this revelation, all such news to me that I did not know how to respond with any comfort. My mother was quite right in keeping this from my brothers. They would have been very angry to learn this family history. "Oh, Mum, what can I say? This is awful." Mum's sister was very loving, and we children called her Mum too, though she was our auntie. Dad was a great dad and a prosperous farmer, so we children were never in want of any kind. We loved school, each had our own pony and were good riders from a young age, winning awards at shows. However, when we were gone, I understand that Dad missed us terribly and began to drink. He died a few years later with a broken heart. In Sydney, we 5 were fostered out, firstly to a Mrs. Thompson at Seaforth for some months, but then were returned to the Paddington State Ward home. Later, a Mrs. Humphreys at Hurstville took us in. My older sister Pearl had gone into service at a mansion at Strathfield by this time, so there were just 4 of us. That didn't last either, so back again to Paddington. "Oh, Mum, I remember visiting Mrs. Humphreys with you when I was small," I recalled. "She was such a nice old lady." Mum nodded. One day, a Mrs. Grigg arrived to select a girl as companion for her daughter, who was becoming very spoilt. She inspected the 9-year-old girls and selected me. Matron agreed. "That would be my choice, but if you take her, there are 3 brothers who must be included." "But I don't want them," Mrs. Grigg replied and left. She lived on a farm at the Oaks near Camden. This was a happy memory for Mum. However, she returned a few days later and said that she would see that the 3 boys were happily accommodated at adjacent farms. Though we would not live under the same roof, we would attend church and Sunday school together, go to school together, and see each other frequently. It was an arrangement that worked well. We were happy, and you know how bonded we all are. A warm, motherly woman, Mrs. Grigg treated me as her daughter. Mum paused again. In time, we learned that Dad had died, but he had acknowledged each of us in his will. His farm was auctioned off and we were to receive our inheritances when we turned 21. That's how I was able to buy and furnish our Willoughby home before I married your father. But what about Uncle Jeff? I thought he was your brother. I was puzzled. Yes, he is my baby brother, Geoffrey. He was only 2 when we were sent away, and the judge allowed him to stay with his mother. Mum later married a farmer and breeder of champion draft horses, and Jeff lived with them till he bought his own farm with his inheritance. She hesitated. His stepfather was never kind to him. Mum had another son, Jeff's half-brother and the favoured one. That son died of tetanus when Jeff was a teenager, but Jeff learned lots from his stepfather, and as a farmer later, he did very well. Then my mother related how she had been coldly rejected by her mother. Another shock. Over the years, I'd had many happy times staying with that grandmother. Mum said, "When we were visiting and went to town one day with your grandmother, she introduced me to friends as, 'This is Mrs. Neville from Sydney.' Not her daughter." I took Mum's hand and embraced her tightly. We wept. That was a bitter moment. It really hurt. But it was a revelation all the same. Mum was shaking. My mind in turmoil. I had no words to describe what this all meant. I realised that my mother's experiences and suffering had taught her much, and I and my brothers were beneficiaries of this tragic past. We had been truly blessed to have our warm, understanding, and compassionate mother. The end.